The tarpaulin, or tarp, is one of the most versatile forms of shelter. It's light, it's compact, generally very waterproof, and in my opinion, it's one of the best for camp in the bush. You can use them to set up quick shelters if there is a storm coming, or with a little more time, you can set up a more extravagant shelter that will be comfortable to sleep under for multiple days. In this video, I'm going to show you 21 different ways to set up a tarp. Some setups will be more suited to sleep underground, others for sleeping off the ground in a hammock. In this video, I use a 3x3 meters square tarp. It has 19 tie points around the edge and through the middle of the tarp. This allows more versatility when setting up different shelter systems. To the majority of these tarp setups, you will need to know how to tie a ridgeline. So before we begin, I will quickly show you one of the methods I use to set up this ridgeline. First, I tie a bowline loop or a simple overhand loop at the end of the cordage. Then wrap the cord around the tree. Then I push the main ridgeline through the loop and insert a small stick, and then pull down tight on the ridgeline, and the stick will stop the loop from slipping. At this point, I can let go my ridgeline and the knot will still stay tight. I walk the ridgeline across to the other tree and tie a tracker's hitch knot. To do this, wrap your ridgeline around the tree. Then with the ridgeline held between my thumb and forefingers, I rotate my wrist so ridgeline twists on itself. You can see that I have now formed a small loop, and then grab the ridgeline with my fingers and pull it through to lock the knot and form a loop. Next, I pass the remaining loosened off cord through this loop and pull it back on itself as tight as I can. To secure the knot, I make a quick release loop. The Adirondack Shelter is traditionally a three-side log structure. You can manipulate a tarp to form an Adirondack-style shelter, which will offer protection from the elements from three sides, and it's great for when to camping in front of a low fire. The first step is to hook one corner of your tarp at the ridgeline. I'd like to set my ridgeline at above shoulder height. For this particular shelter, you will need couple of toggles. I just carved these two wood toggles from a stick. You will also need to tie a small loop in two separate pieces of cord. Attach these loops at either end of your ridgeline using what called a prusic knot. Simply wrap the loop through itself and over the ridgeline 3 times and pull it down to cinch the knot. If tied right, it should resemble of this. This knot is great for adjusting the tightness of your top. When there is no downward pressure in the knot, it can move freely across the ridgeline, but as soon as you apply downward force, it pinches on itself and prevents itself from sliding. Attach a toggle to your tarp by wrapping the prusic loop through the tarp tie point, and then wedge the toggle in between to stop the knot from slipping. As you pull on the toggle, the tarp will get tighter. Attach toggle to the other end so then there is equal pressure. For the next step, you will need pegs. You can't carry metal pegs with you, or if you wish to save on weight, you can carve some with your knife. Go around the back of the tarp and peg out the tie-out points that they are directly opposite the toggles. Then fold the far corner of the tarp underneath. This can help to act as a ground sheet. Then peg down the 2 further tie-up points on the sides of the tarp. This will create side walls to your shelter. You can then either tie up the remaining cord to a tree to form a roof, or you can flip it back over the ridgeline, attach a guy line to the middle of the tarp, and tie this up to a tree. Doing this will give you much more room at the back of the shelter The advantages of this type of shelter is that it reflects heat towards your body if you have a fire in front of you. There is plenty of room in this shelter to lie down and sit up, and the option of having an extendable roof. Despite these advantages, it takes a while to set up. You're not left much material to form a ground sheet, and you're unable to stand up inside the shelter. The next tarp shelter is by far one of the easiest to set up, using the same two toggles in the previous shelter. Tie out the two end points of the tarp. Now all you need to do is peg down the remaining tie-out points at the back of the tarp, and you have yourself a simple lean-to shelter. The advantages of this type of shelter is that it's super fast and easy to set up. Also, it has plenty of room underneath to store your gear, and there is plenty of airflow, so if you have a fire, you won't get smoked out. However, it's also affected if there is strong winds, and in winter you will be exposed to the elements much more. Plus, there is no ground sheet with this type of shelter. Despite these disadvantages, you can actually arrange the shelter into 3 different types of setup. For example, just by lowering the ridgeline and pulling the remaining half of the tarp over it, you can make a lean-to shelter with a roof. Keep the tie-out points of the back pegged down and use 2 sticks around the chest height at each corner in front of the tarp. As these are support sticks and not pushed into the ground, you need to peg them down using some cord. For this you can use an adjustable guideline hitch or tie a cord to the peg like in the video. You now have a tarp shelter with a roof, a lean-to shelter with a roof. This shelter is steady and gives you a good visibility of the surrounding nature. If you have a campfire nearby, the heat will radiate around the inside the shelter. However, it doesn't incorporate the ground sheet, and it takes a little longer to set up, as you need the sources, the upright sticks. If the wind changes direction and starts blowing directly into the shelter, you can quickly adapt the shelter into an A-frame by removing the sticks and pegging down the remaining tie-out points. This type of setup is great for stormy conditions, and you still have plenty of room for your gear. However, you won't be able to stand up in it, but that can quickly be changed. All you need to do is undo all of the pegs and tie 4 guy lines to the tie-out points at each corner of the tarp. Then loosen your ridgeline knots and raise the ridgeline above your head. Tie out each guy line to a peg in the ground. Tighten the 2 toggles at each end of the tarp. These 2 toggles have remained in this place for the previous 3 shelter setups. Now you have a flying A-frame. The term flying tarp is used when your tarp setup does not touching the ground. With your A-frame shelter setup like this, you can now stand up underneath it, and it gives you room to set up a hammock too. It's great in heavy rain and strong winds. If you need more room when sleeping in a hammock, you can always rotate the tarp, so the tarp hangs diagonally. For this setup you only need tie 2 guy lines instead of 4. This diagonal flying tarp setup offers more protection during strong winds and heavy rain. It also provides more overhang when you are camping in a hammock. There is still plenty of headroom, and if you want, you could open up one side of the tarp to get a better view of the surrounding nature. Those 6 tarp setups that you have just seen allows plenty of room for your gear, and they offer good protection from the elements. They are also relatively easy to set up. However, they are quite obvious and can be seen quite easily in the woods. So what if you need to keep a low profile? in which case you're going to need to be stealthy. Check out these 6 stealth tarp setups that you can make using the exact same tarp from the previous shelters that I showed you. For the first of the stealth tarp setup, I've hung the tarp over the ridgeline exactly like I did for the A-frame setup. However, I've lowered the ridgeline to just below my waist. I start by pegging out the first tie-out point below the ridgeline, and then do the same at the opposite side. Now, this shelter would work better with a smaller tarp, but it can still be made with this one. Go around to the front of the shelter and double the tarp under itself. Secure this part of the tarp to the toggles on the ridgeline, and do the same at the other end. And then all you need to do is form yourself the ground sheet. This low profile shelter is sometimes called the C-fly, as from the side it looks like a letter C. If the weather turned back and you are in a storm, you can lower the roof of the shelter to allow greater runoff for rain and protect you from strong winds. This type of shelter is known the C-fly wedge, as you have created a wedge-like shape. You can further modify the C-fly to give you a better shelter in a stormy or rainy weather. To do this, just unpack the guide lines and simply take out the vertical support sticks. Then unfold the roof and stretch the tarp, and then peg down the tie-out points. Now you have an extended A-frame with a ground sheet, and it still has plenty of room for your gear. You can further adapt this shelter if you want to have probably the strongest steel shelter in a storm. To construct the body back, simply peg out each corner of the tarp, then tuck the tarp underneath itself and do the same to the opposite side. Now you have created a mini A-frame shelter with a double layer ground sheet. This shelter protects you from many sides, including the ground. However, as you can see, it is extremely restricted. The next low profile shelter is a steel shelter. For this one you need the 3 center tie-out points at one end of your tarp to be near the ridgeline. I use the wood toggles to secure 2 ends of this to the ridgeline. Then peg down the 2 remaining corners at an angle. Go around the back of the shelter and fold half of the tarp underneath itself. Find the 3 next tie-out points, that they are opposite of the ridgeline, and peg them down. If there are any tie-out points remaining, peg this down too. Remember to keep the tarp tight. Go back around the front of the shelter and pull out the remaining piece of loose tarp to form your ground sheet. This shelter offers protection from the back, from the ground and from the sides, and it allows you an open view of nature in front of you. You can also adopt this shelter to create even more space inside. Unfold the loosened tarp underneath that form your ground sheet and raise it up to form a ground Bivi. Lift up the tie-out points that you have pegged down at the back and raise them up using a stick or a guideline tied to a tree behind of the shelter. Do the same on the opposite side and make sure there is a slight downward slip from your ridgeline so that rain can be shed. You still have some spare tarp remaining to use it as a ground sheet. The great thing about the ground Bivi shelter is that you have more space behind you to store your gear. Those past 5 steel shelters are really useful if you need to keep a low profile when camping, but they all lack one thing: headroom. If you need more headroom and still need to keep a relatively low profile, you can make yourself a Tarp Tipi. To do this, tie out the front middle point of your tarp to your ridgeline. You will need to raise your ridgeline slightly just to allow more headroom. Find the second tie-out points down from the center and peg it in. Do the same to the opposite side, then go around the back and peg down the rest of tied points. But don't do the very end ones, as this will allow you to tack under the loose tarp again to create your ground sheet. Now you have a tipi style tarp, which has more headroom than the lower profile ones. All of the tarp setups that you have just seen involve the use of ridgeline. But what if you find yourself needing to set up camp and there are no trees? You're running out of time and you can't see any woodland or forest nearby. For this next setup, all you will need is a stick or an adjustable trekking pole, or even use a camera tripod to set this up. To start with, lay your tarp flat on the ground. Go to the back corners of the tarp and peg out the two tie-up points that they are immediately next to the corners tie-up points. Remember, this is going to be the back of your shelter, so take note which direction the wind is coming from. Tuck the loose corner at the end of the tarp underneath and do the same on the opposite side. Next, go to the front corner tie-up points and find the tie-up loop next to it. Keep your hand on this tie-up loop and bring the corner tie-up point to where it was. Peg that corner tie-up point in. Then go to the opposite side of the tarp and do the same thing. Now grab your stick or hiking pole and tuck this underneath and into the middle of the tarp. Make sure if you're using a stick that the top of it is not too sharp. You might need to round off the edges. Attach two guy lines to the front tie-up points and fold this back on themselves. For this, I'd like to use an adjustable guy line hitch. To tie this knot, wrap one end of cord around the peg in the ground. Wrap the remaining working end over and through the fixed end that is tied to your tarp. Do this twice, then make one more wrap around the outside of working end and tie it. This knot can now slide up and down and adjust the tension of your tarp. Because the tarp tent has a number of angles to it, it holds up really well at strong winds. You can tie out the front part of the tarp to help shed rain away from the entrance. Once complete, your shelter should look like this. The great advantage of this shelter is that it acts like a tent, so it has plenty of space inside for you to store your gear and keep dry from the rain. The next tarp shelter is one of the easiest to set up. It's kinda look like an arrowhead. Start by taking the middle tied point of an edge and peg that in. Then on the diagonal corner, grab the first tied point from the corner and peg that in. Do the same on the other side. Then tack the remaining fabric in and this will become the ground sheet. Then use a stick to raise the edge. Then peg in the remaining corner flaps. These front parts will give you some extra protection from the wind and rain. This shelter is great in strong winds, and it gives you a good ground sheet and plenty of room to store your gear and lay down. I really don't have a name for the next setup, but let's call it the sandwich. At first step, fold the tarp like in the video. Then peg in each corner tied point. Later go inside between and lay down and use a small piece of stick to raise the edge a little. This setup can be one of the great choices when you get surprised by the storm, and it's great for emergency situations. It gives you full protection from the elements, and you can set this shelter up under 2 minutes. For the next emergency setup, we have the pyramid shelter. Start by pegging one corner into the ground, then peg the opposite corner in. Then for the remaining two corners, pull them toward and using the same peg, peg them into the ground. Then grab your stick, place it inside. Now you have the pyramid. The benefit of this setup is It's super fast and simple to set up, and it completely protects you from wind and rain, but condensation may be an issue. The Gunyah. This is one of my favorite tarp configuration as it gives you good protection from the elements and it's quite versatile. Start by pegging one corner into the ground, then take the other corner and peg that in. Now take the middle tie out, stretch that out and peg that into the ground. This will be the ground sheet. Then take the corner, fold that over and peg it about half a meter from the corner of the ground sheet that's already pegged in. Now grab the middle tie-out point and using a guy line and a stick and peg that into the ground and tension the line. Do the same in the other side. Attach a guy line to the roof and peg that in. At the back of the tarp, attach another guy line and tie it to a tree or use a stick and peg that in. This gives you more internal space. If the weather is fine, you can raise the roof and fold it back to make yourself more room. There is plenty of space to lie down or sit comfortably as well as room to store your gear. The great thing about this shelter is it's versatile. If the weather turns to the worst, you can quickly and easily adjust the shelter by removing one of the support sticks and peg that corner into the ground. It provides more coverage and it's great in windy conditions. I don't know what to call the next shelter or what others call it, but it's lovely setup. Make the ground sheet as like as the last shelter, the Gunyah. Then attach a guy line to the middle tie-out point of opposite side and fold that over. Then use a stick and peg that in. Later, use the same peg for the two flaps and peg them into the ground. Now you have an unknown setup. You can also attach a guy line to the back of the shelter to provide you more internal space. The next setup, Bungalow, is pretty unique. It feels like a little house with two rooms when you are inside. Start by pegging a corner into the ground. Next, peg the opposite corner in. Then take the back remaining corner, hold it out the square located with the first tie-out point from the corners and bring the corner to that spot. Next, take the front remaining corner, move it to roughly the halfway point and peg that in. Then take a stick to create the entrance and use a guy line to secure it in place. Then use another stick and place it inside at the back of the shelter to open up the space. Then take the remaining tie-out points and peg them in until you get a nice and tight shelter. There is a lot of space inside this shelter for two person and gears, and it gives you a very good coverage. Now the option is, you take a stick and raise the corner. This will open up the shelter. The downward of this shelter though is, it doesn't provide you a ground sheet. The next and final tarp setup that I'm going to show you is one of the best. It's very easy to set up and you don't need a ridge line to support it. It's called the Plow Point shelter, and all you really need is one tree. Typically, you don't need any guy lines for this shelter. You can just tie the corner of the tarp to a tree and peg out the rest of your tie-up points, but because I'm gonna to have a fire, I don't want to have the fire near a tree, so I use the guy line to stand my shelter further away from a tree. I also tie a guy line at the back middle tie-out point to create more space inside. Any tie-out points that they are close to the ground are pegs down. Also, you can incorporate a ground sheet by setting up the shelter near a tree and tucking under any remaining tarp. So that's it, 21 different tarp setups that you can do when out camping in the woods.